Joanne awoke not to the harsh intrusion of a dream, but to a silence so heavy it felt like a physical weight pressing against the timbers of the cottage. Usually, the morning was a symphony of survival, the frantic chattering of squirrels, the distant rhythmic drumming of a woodpecker, or the groan of the trees under the weight of the Blackwood frost. Today, the world had held its breath. She lay still beneath her thin, frayed blankets, her muscles aching from the previous day's excursion into the icy creek. Beside her, tucked into a nest of old wool, the silver-furred pup remained in a deep, twitching sleep. Its breathing was the only sound in the room, a soft, wet huffing that reminded her she was no longer entirely alone. She reached out a hand, her skin still pale and mapped with the faint blue lines of the cold, and touched the pup's flank. It was warm. Miraculously, they had both survived a night. The fire in the hearth had died down to a few glowing orange eyes buried in ash. Shivering, Joanne swung her legs out of bed. The floorboards were like shards of ice against her soles. She dressed in layers of coarse wool, her movements stiff, her mind already cataloging the day's chores: melt snow for water, check the snares, try to find more of the dry moss that helped the fire catch. But as she moved toward the door to check the weather, the hair on her arms stood up. There was a presence behind the wood, not the frantic scratching of a predator trying to get in, but a focused collective energy that made the air feel electric. Joanne's hand hesitated on the iron latch. 3 months ago, in the court, she would have called for a maid or a guard. Now, she reached for the small, rusted skinning knife she kept on the mantel. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird in a cage of bone. She thought of Stephen Williams, of the Marshal Stacy Thomas, and the long reach of a king's obsessed hand. Had they found her? Was this the silence of an ambush? She pulled the door open a crack. The breath died in her throat. The world outside had been transformed. The small, muddy clearing in front of her cabin was gone, replaced by a sea of fur and amber light. Wolves. They were everywhere, perched on the gray boulders, sitting beneath the low-hanging hemlock boughs, and standing in the open snow. She counted 10, then 30, then realized the numbers stretched back into the tree line until they were nothing but silhouettes against the morning mist. 100 pairs of eyes, all the same burning gold, were fixed solely on her. They didn't snarl, they didn't move. They sat in perfect, terrifying formation, an army of ancient shadows that had emerged from the heart of the Blackwood to surround her sanctuary. In the center of the clearing, directly in front of her porch, stood the largest wolf Joanne had ever seen. His coat was a midnight abyss, absorbing the weak morning light. He stood as tall as a pony, his shoulders corded with muscle that spoke of 1,000 kills. This was no mere animal. This was the Alpha, the Richmond king of the wild. Joanne's knees weakened, her fingers trembling so violently the knife clattered against the doorframe. She looked at the pup inside, then back at the massive beast. "I only meant to help him," she whispered, her voice cracking in the stillness. The black wolf tilted his massive head. He stepped forward, the snow crunching softly under his paws. The rest of the pack remained motionless, a silent audience to this strange communion. He stopped just inches from the porch, his golden gaze searching Joanne's face with an intelligence that was hauntingly, unnervingly human. Then the air began to ripple. Joanne watched, her eyes wide with a mixture of horror and awe, as the wolf's form began to blur like heat rising off a summer road. The sound was one she would never forget, the wet, heavy thud of shifting bone and the stretch of skin. The midnight fur receded, melting into bronzed, scarred flesh. The spine elongated, the paws stretched into powerful hands, and the muzzle flattened into a face of devastating, rugged beauty. Where the beast had been, a man now rose to his full height, Rennick. He stood naked against the biting winter wind, seemingly indifferent to the frost that would have killed a lesser man. His hair was as dark as the wolf's coat, falling in wild tangles past his broad, muscular shoulders. His chest was mapped with the history of the forest, old scars from claws and brambles, and around his neck hung a heavy iron chain. But it was his eyes that held her paralyzed. They remained amber, feral and knowing, pinning her to the spot. Joanne couldn't speak. Her throat was tight with the memory of the court, the powdered faces, the false smiles, the suffocating rules of proper men like Stephen Williams. This man was the antithesis of everything she had fled. He was the earth and the shadow, the hunter and the protector. Rennick didn't move toward her. Instead, he reached down to the ground beside him. For the first time, Joanne noticed what lay at his feet. A young buck, its neck croaking cleanly, the meat fresh and steaming in the cold air. It was a king's ransom of food for a woman who had been living on bark tea and hope. With a deliberate, slow grace, Rennick pushed the carcass toward her doorstep. He looked from the gift to Joanne, and then his gaze drifted toward the interior of the cottage, where the silver pup was now standing yapping at the threshold. A ghost of a smile, or perhaps a grimace of respect, touched the corner of his mouth. Joanne Jame. His voice was a low, resonant rumble that seemed to vibrate in the very boards of the floor beneath her feet. It was the sound of a landslide, unused to the shape of human words, but commanding nonetheless. "You know my name?" she gasped, clutching the doorframe. Rennick didn't answer. He didn't need to. The presence of the pack behind him spoke for him. He took a single step back, his amber eyes never leaving hers. In that gaze, Joanne didn't see the claiming she had feared from Stephen. There was no ownership here, no desire to break or bend her. Instead, there was a silent pact being offered, a recognition of the mercy she had shown his blood, and a promise of the violence he would inflict on anyone who dared disturb her peace. He had marked her, not with a brand or a ring, but with the presence of 100. Rennick began to shift back, his body rippling once more into the midnight fur. He let out a single low howl that was instantly echoed by the 100 voices behind him. The sound washed over Joanne like a physical force, a primal benediction that made her heart hammer with a strange, terrifying new hope. When the last echo faded, the black wolf turned and loped toward the trees. As if on a single command, the sea of fur followed. They melted into the Blackwood as quickly as they had appeared, leaving nothing behind but the silence, the deep indentations in the snow, and the fresh kill at her feet. Joanne stood in the doorway, the cold air biting at her skin, but for the first time in 3 months, she didn't feel the chill. She looked down at the buck, then at the silver pup who was now nuzzling her hand. She was no longer just a fugitive hiding in a lonely cottage. She was a woman protected by the Richmond Alpha. She was pack. And as the sun finally climbed over the horizon, casting a pale golden light over the clearing, Joanne realized that the cage she had run into had suddenly become a fortress. Stephen Williams might have the law and the gold, but she had the shadows. And for the first time, the shadows were on her side.
The silence that followed the departure of the 100 was not the empty, fearful quiet Joanne had grown accustomed to. It was a heavy, expectant stillness, as if the forest itself were standing guard. For 3 days, Joanne lived on the bounty Rennick had left, the venison providing a strength she hadn't felt since her flight from the capital. But more than the food, it was the sensation of being watched, not by a predator, but by a sentinel that changed the air within the lonely cottage. On the 4th afternoon, the sentinel revealed himself. Joanne was at the hearth, stirring a thin stew of winter roots and dried meat, when the light from the open window was suddenly eclipsed. She didn't jump. Her heart didn't hammer with the frantic rhythm of a rabbit. Instead, a strange, calm heat spread through her chest. She turned slowly to find him leaning against the doorframe. Rennick was no longer the midnight wolf, but he was far from the polished, perfumed men Joanne had known in the court of Stephen Williams. He wore the rough spun shirt and trousers she had left on the porch, though they looked absurdly small on his frame, the seams groaning against the sheer breadth of his shoulders. His dark hair was a wild crown, and his amber eyes remained the only vibrant color in the room, luminous as polished coins. He didn't speak. He didn't even acknowledge her with a nod. He simply existed there, his presence so massive and overwhelming that the small cottage seemed to shrink around him. Rennick. He stepped inside, his movements fluid and soundless despite his size. He didn't look like a monster, though the raw power in his limbs suggested he could snap the cottage's support beams if he chose. He looked like a man who had been forged by the elements, part stone, part storm, and entirely unyielding. He walked to the corner where the silver pup Asher lay gnawing on a scrap of leather. The pup yapped and rolled onto its back, a display of pure, unadulterated joy that Rennick met with a single grounding hand placed on the creature's belly. "Sit," Joanne said, her voice sounding small and crystalline in the quiet. Rennick's gaze shifted from the pup to her. He didn't sit, his eyes tracking the way she held the wooden ladle. There was a primal curiosity in his expression, the look of a scholar studying a lost civilization, or a hunter gauging the intent of an unknown creature. "You are healing," she ventured, moving toward him with a bowl of the stew. She kept her movements slow, showing him her hands were empty of weapons. He took the bowl, his fingers brushing hers. The contact was electric, a jolt of heat that made Joanne's breath hitch. Her skin was unnaturally warm, humming with the vitality of the beast that lived just beneath the surface. He looked at the stew, then back at her, his head tilting in that hauntingly wolf-like gesture. "Eat," she encouraged, miming the action. He took a mouthful, his brow furrowing at the complexity of the flavors, the salt, the wild onion, the slow-simmered fat. He finished the bowl in silence, then placed it on the table with a heaviness that suggested he wasn't used to such delicate objects. "Thank you," he rumbled. The words were gravelly, torn from a throat more used to howls than vowels. He looked at the table, then at the books she had neatly arranged on the shelf, volumes on botany and history she had snatched during her escape. Joanne realized then that he wasn't just a shifter, he was a prince of a forgotten line, a man who straddled the boundary between the ancient magic of the Blackwood and the crumbling structures of human society. He wasn't a monster, he was a man who had lost his tongue to the wild and now was trying to find his way back across the bridge. "This is a book," she said, reaching for the smallest volume. She sat at the table and gestured for him to join her. This time he complied, his knees nearly hitting the underside of the wood as he sat on the crude stool. She opened the pages, pointing to a sketch of a winter rose. "Rose," she said clearly. Rennick leaned in. The scent of him filled her senses. Pine needles, cold rain, and something muskier, something deep and masculine that made her skin tingle. He touched the page with a calloused fingertip, his touch surprisingly light. "Rose," he repeated. The sound was rough, but the intelligence in his eyes was staggering. He wasn't just learning a word, he was reclaiming a concept. For hours, the only sounds in the cottage were the crackle of the fire and the low, steady murmur of Joanne's voice. She taught him the names of the things that surrounded them: table, fire, window, cold. She taught him the names for the feelings she saw flickering in his golden eyes: safety, hunger, and a word he seemed to hold on to with particular intensity: mate. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the snow outside in shades of violet and bruised blue, Rennick stood. The lesson was over, but the atmosphere had shifted irrevocably. He walked to the door, but before he stepped out into the dark, he turned back to her. He didn't have the words yet to tell her that he had spent the last 3 months watching her from the shadows, marveling at her resilience. He couldn't explain that the King's Marshal was already scouring the lower valleys, or that the smell of Stacy Thomas's horses was already tainting the wind. But as he looked at Joanne, this high-born woman who had traded silk for wool and a palace for a ruin, he reached out and touched the hollow of her throat. His thumb traced the frantic pulse there. His touch was a claim, but not like the one Stephen Williams had intended. It was a promise of protection, a vow that the 100 wolves were merely the first line of defense. "Joanne," he whispered. It was the only word he said perfectly. He disappeared into the night, leaving the door ajar for a split second before the wind pushed it shut. Joanne stood in the center of the room, her hand rising to touch the spot where his skin had met hers. She was teaching him her language, yes, but as she looked at the silver pup sleeping by the hearth and felt the lingering heat of Rennick's presence, she realized he was teaching her something else. He was teaching her that freedom wasn't just running away from a master, it was choosing a protector. It was the realization that in the heart of the Blackwood, she was no longer a victim hiding in a lonely cottage. She was a woman being courted by the wild, and for the first time in her life, she wasn't afraid of what the darkness might hold. The golden warmth of the cottage felt increasingly like a fragile illusion as the week wore on. Inside, the air smelled of cedar, simmering broth, and the clean, wild scent of Rennick. But outside, the wind had begun to carry a different weight. It was a sharpness that had nothing to do with the frost. Joanne Jame found herself standing by the window more often, her eyes scanning the tree line not for the comforting shadows of the 100, but for the glint of steel. She knew the way the world of men worked. It was a slow, grinding machine that didn't stop until it crushed what it sought. She looked at her hands, calloused now, the dirt of the Blackwood etched into the lines of her palms, and wondered if the woman who had fled the capital was even recognizable anymore. To Stephen Williams, she was a piece of property, a political seal to be pressed upon a new decree. To the forest, she was becoming something else entirely. 10 miles away, in the village of Oakhaven, the world she had fled had finally arrived. The village was a collection of gray stone and damp thatch, usually ignored by the crown, but today it was choked with the crimson and gold of the king's marshal. Stacy Thomas dismounted her horse in the center of the square, her movements as fluid and dangerous as a drawn blade. She didn't look like a common soldier. She moved with the terrifying precision of someone who had never lost a trail. She was a woman of elegant but wounded grace, carrying the weight of a destiny she didn't ask for but served with lethal efficiency. Her eyes, sharp as a hawk's, scanned the humble faces of the villagers, looking for the lie that would lead her to the prize. Stacy pulled a piece of parchment from her saddlebag, smoothing it out against the rough wood of the tavern's exterior wall. It was a portrait of Joanne, captured in charcoal with the delicate lines of a woman meant for a throne. "A noble woman," Stacy's voice rang out, cold and clear as mountain water. "Last seen heading toward the Blackwood, she is a fugitive of the law and a ward of the king. The man who hides her commits treason. The man who finds her finds a life of gold. Who has seen her?" The villagers huddled together, their breath misting in the air. They knew the girl in the lonely cottage, of course. They had seen the smoke from her chimney and the quiet way she traded herbs for salt. But they also knew the Blackwood was not a place where men went to find things. It was a place where things were lost. They feared the marshal, but they feared the ancient shadows of the woods more. One old woodsman looked at the marshal's silver-etched armor and then at the dark, looming silhouette of the forest. He stayed silent, but the terror in his eyes was a map Stacy Thomas knew how to read. She didn't need their words, she only needed their fear to point the way. Back at the cottage, Joanne felt the noose tightening before she even heard the horses. It was a prickle at the base of her neck, a systemic dread she had learned to trust during her years in the capital. The air felt heavy, saturated with the electricity of a gathering storm. When Rennick arrived that evening, ducking his head to enter the small space, she didn't meet him with a book or a lesson. She stood by the hearth, her hands tucked into her sleeves to hide their trembling. The silver pup, Asher, sensed the tension, whining low in his throat and circling her ankles. Rennick sensed the shift immediately. He dropped a bundle of dry kindling by the fire, his amber eyes narrowing as they searched her face. He took a step toward her, his presence filling the room with a heat that usually made her feel safe, but today it only made her heart ache with the weight of impending loss.
He was a man of the wild, rugged and survival-driven, and he didn't understand the complex cruelty of a king's obsession. To him, an enemy was something you fought with claw and tooth. He didn't know about the armies that could march for months just to reclaim a single person. "You have to go," she said, her voice a brittle whisper that barely carried over the crackle of the flames. Rennick froze. The word "go" was one they had practiced, but the way she said it, flat, final, and laced with a burgeoning panic, made him growl low in his chest. He reached out to touch her shoulder, his hand large and warm, but Joanne stepped back, putting the heavy oak table between them like a barricade. "They are in the village, Rennick. The marshal. Stacy Thomas is there, and she doesn't stop until she finds what she's looking for." Joanne's voice rose, fueled by a desperate need to protect the only peace she had ever known. "If they find me here with you, they won't just take me. They'll burn this forest. They'll bring silver and fire for the pack. They'll hunt every wolf from here to the high peaks just to prove a point. They will kill Asher." At the mention of the pup, Rennick's expression darkened into something truly primal. He looked toward the corner where Asher was watching them, his ears pricked. Then he looked back at Joanne, a stubborn, slow movement of his head. "No," he rumbled. "Protect. Pack stays." "You don't understand the king's wrath," Joanne cried, her resilience finally fracturing into raw terror for him, for the 100 who watched the woods. "Stephen Williams doesn't want a wife, he wants a trophy. He will tear the world apart to prove no one can hide from him. I am a plague. I bring the death of the civilized world to everything I touch. If you stay, you become a target for an army that doesn't care about honor or the laws of the wild." She moved toward him then, not to embrace him, but to push against his chest with all her might. Her small hands were lost against the wall of his muscles, her strength inconsequential against his weight. She felt like a bird battering itself against an oak tree. "Leave! Take the pack and go deep into the mountains where their horses can't follow. I'll go to the village. I'll tell them I was lost, that I wandered here by accident. I'll go back to the silk and the cages. Just please don't let them kill you because of me." Rennick didn't budge. He caught her wrists in one of his massive hands, his grip firm but careful not to bruise her skin. He pulled her forward until she was inches from him, forced to look into the gold of his eyes. There was no fear there, but a fierce, predatory calm that made her own panic feel small. He brought her hands up to his chest, pressing them over his heart. It was beating slow and steady, like the deep, ancient pulse of the earth itself. It was the heartbeat of a creature that did not know how to be a victim. "Joanne," he said, his voice a vibration that seemed to settle the frantic rhythm of her own heart. He looked at her with an intensity that saw past her noble blood and her fear, seeing only the woman who had saved his kin. "My pack, my woods, no king." "You have hundreds of men, Rennick, cannons and silver and the power of a whole kingdom," she sobbed, her forehead dropping against his chest. The scent of him, pine, rain, and wildness, enveloped her, and for a moment she allowed herself to lean into his strength. Rennick let go of her wrists and wrapped his arms around her, pulling her into the solid, warm reality of his body. He rested his chin atop her dark hair, his gaze fixed on the door. He could already smell the change in the wind, the faint metallic scent of iron, the salt of horse sweat, and the bitter, acrid tang of man-made fire. They were coming, but he was the Alpha of Richmond, and he had spent his entire life learning how to survive the things that thought they were masters of the world. He knew every ravine, every hidden cave, and every treacherous bog. He had the loyalty of the 100, and now he had a reason to fight that went beyond territory. "Let them come," he murmured, the words vibrating through Joanne's frame. It wasn't a boast, it was a simple statement of fact. Joanne realized then that she couldn't push him away more than she could push the moon from the sky.
She had spent her life being claimed by men who saw her as an object, a prize to be won, or a vessel to be filled. But Rennick wasn't claiming her, he was claiming the right to stand in front of her. The monster was the only thing standing between her and the civilized nightmare of her past. She had tried to be noble, tried to sacrifice herself to save the wild, but the wild had no interest in her martyrdom, it only knew how to protect its own. As the first tendrils of wood smoke from the village's evening fires drifted toward the cottage on a shifting wind, Joanne stopped fighting. She reached up, her fingers tangling in the rough, coarse fabric of Rennick's shirt, and held on. The marshal's shadow was long, and the king's reach was vast, but as the silver pup curled around her ankle, and the man who was a wolf tightened his hold, Joanne Jame stopped being a victim running from fate. She was a woman choosing her side. Outside, the 100 wolves began to shift in the darkness, a silent, silver-eyed perimeter forming a mile wide around the lonely cottage. They moved through the brush like gray smoke, ghosting past the ancient oaks. The war was no longer something Joanne could avoid by hiding. It was at her doorstep, and for the first time in her life, she didn't feel like a fugitive. She felt like a queen of the shadows, waiting for the world of men to realize they were no longer in control. The marshal was close, but in the heart of the Blackwood, the marshal was just another scent on the wind, and the king was just another hunter who had wandered too far from home. Joanne closed her eyes and listened to the silence, knowing it was the last quiet night she would have for a very long time.
The heavy atmospheric dread of the Blackwood had shifted. It was no longer a place where Joanne Jame merely waited for the end. It had become an arena. For weeks, she had been the teacher, showing Rennick the shape of human vowels and the weight of history held within ink and parchment. But as the shadow of Stacy Thomas grew long over the valley, the roles reversed. Rennick understood that for Joanne to survive the coming storm, she could no longer move like a lady of the court. She had to learn the language of the forest, a language written in blood, breath, and silence. The lessons began before the sun had even thought of breaching the horizon. The air inside the lonely cottage was still warm from the banked embers of the hearth, but Rennick offered no comfort. He stood by the door, a silhouette of raw, unyielding power, and beckoned her into the biting gray mist of the pre-dawn. He didn't use words. He didn't have to. The golden intensity of his gaze was a command she had learned to obey without question. He had refused to leave when she begged him to flee the king's marshal, and now his refusal had transformed into a grim curriculum. Outside, the world was a study in silver and iron. The frost had turned the fallen leaves into shards of glass that shattered under a careless foot. Joanne followed him into the deep brush, her breath hitching as the cold bit through her wool cloak. Rennick stopped at the edge of a frozen ridge and turned to her. He pointed at her feet, then at the ground. "Noise," he rumbled, the word vibrating with a warning. He moved then, a demonstration of impossible grace. Despite his massive frame, he crossed a bed of dry, brittle twigs without making a sound. Not a snap, not a rustle. He was a shadow moving through shadows. When he reached the other side, he looked back at her, waiting. Joanne tried to mimic his gait, but her first step was met with a loud, treacherous crack that seemed to echo like a gunshot in the stillness. She winced, looking up at him, expecting the cold disdain she had seen in the eyes of the palace instructors. Instead, she saw a fierce, burning patience. He returned to her side, his hand heavy on her shoulder as he guided her weight. He pressed her down, forcing her to lower her center of gravity, his touch a constant grounding heat. He showed her how to feel the earth through the soles of her boots, to find the soft moss and the solid stone instead of the dry rot. For hours, they paced the same small circle of forest. Her thighs burned and her toes went numb, but by the time the sun was high enough to turn the frost into dew, she had learned the first rule of the Blackwood: silence is the only armor that never breaks.
As the days bled into one another, the training grew more grueling. Rennick was a demanding master because he knew the stakes better than she did. He taught her to read the wind, to understand that the scent of iron and horseflesh meant the marshal was near, even if she couldn't see the crimson of their cloaks. He showed her how to disappear into the scenery, to wrap herself in the gray and brown of the ancient oaks until a man could stand 3 feet away and see nothing but the forest. The gentle Joanne, the woman who had once spent her afternoons in embroidery and sipping tea, was dying. In her place, something leaner and more resilient was being forged. Her hands, once soft and pale, were now mapped with small cuts and hardened by work. Her dark hair, usually pinned in elaborate coils, now hung in a single practical braid. She found a strange feral joy in the exertion. Every ache in her muscles was a reminder that she was no longer a victim waiting to be claimed. She was a creature learning to bite back. He taught her to fight not with the choreographed flourishes of a duelist, but with the efficiency of a predator. He showed her how to use her smaller stature to her advantage, how to strike at the vulnerable joints and the soft throat. They sparred in the mud and the melting snow, Rennick pulling his punches but never allowing her to be soft. When she fell, he didn't offer a hand to help her up. He waited for her to find her own footing, to find the anger that would fuel her rise. One evening, after a particularly exhausting session of tracking through the high crags, they sat together by a small, hidden stream. The silver pup, Asher, was busy pouncing on shadows nearby, his strength growing by the day. Joanne looked at Rennick, who was sharpening a piece of flint with focused intensity. "You aren't just teaching me to hide, are you?" she asked, her voice stronger than it had been since she arrived in the woods. Rennick paused, the flint glinting in the twilight. He looked at her, his amber eyes reflecting the deep gold of the setting sun. "Hide is for rabbit," he said, the words coming easier to him now. "You are not rabbit. You are pack. Pack fights." He reached out, his calloused thumb brushing the underside of her jaw, tilting her face toward him. The intimacy of the gesture sent a different kind of heat through her. It wasn't the panic of being trapped, it was the thrill of being seen. Rennick didn't see a fugitive noblewoman or a trophy for a king. He saw a partner. He saw a woman who had waded into a freezing river to save a life that didn't belong to her, and he was rewarding that bravery with the secrets of his survival. "Stephen will come with fire," she whispered, the old fear trying to claw its way back into her heart, though its grip was weaker now. "Stacy Thomas won't stop until she finds me. They think they own the world, Rennick." Rennick stood, pulling her up with him. He didn't say anything at first. He simply looked out over the vast, dark expanse of the Blackwood, his kingdom of shadows. He let out a low, vibrating growl that made the very air seem to hum. "World is big. King is small." He handed her the sharpened flint, the edge so keen it could draw blood with a whisper. It was a crude weapon compared to the steel swords of the marshal's guards, but as Joanne's fingers closed around the cold stone, she felt a surge of power that no silver-etched blade could provide. This was the forest's edge. This was her edge. She practiced with the flint until her movements were instinctive, learning to draw the blade in a single, fluid motion. She learned to use her environment, to see a low-hanging branch as a trap and a pile of stones as a barricade. Her mind, once filled with the gossip of the court and the rules of etiquette, was now a map of tactical advantages and escape routes. That night, as they returned to the cottage, the atmosphere had shifted again. The lessons were over, and the preparation had begun. Joanne no longer felt like a ghost haunting a ruin. She felt like a predator waiting in the dark. She spent the evening grinding wild herbs, not for stew, but for the blinding powders and sleeping draughts she remembered from her grandmother's old texts. She checked the structural integrity of the cottage's shutters, reinforcing the bars with heavy timber.
Rennick watched her, a quiet pride in his golden eyes. He spent the night on the porch, his form shifting between man and wolf as he coordinated with the 100. The perimeter was widening, the wolves moving like a living tide through the valleys, keeping a constant watch on the marshal's progress. They were a silent army, and Joanne was no longer their ward. She was their strategist. As Joanne lay down to sleep, the silver pup curled at her feet. She realized the deepest flaw she had carried from the capital was finally gone. She had always believed she was meant to be a victim, that her resilience was merely a way to endure suffering. Rennick had shown her resilience was a weapon. She didn't need a crown to be powerful. She just needed the will to survive and the knowledge of how to kill. The transition was complete. The high-born Joanne who had fled in terror was gone, buried under the winter needles of the Blackwood. In the lonely cottage, a new kind of woman had been born, one who didn't rule from a throne of gold, but from a throne of shadow and iron. And as the wind began to howl, carrying the distant sound of a horn from the village below, Joanne Jame didn't tremble. She simply reached for her flint, tested the edge against her thumb, and waited for the dawn. The marshal was coming, and the king was close behind, but they were entering a world where the rules of men didn't apply. They were entering Rennick's world. They were entering hers. And in the silence of the Blackwood, the only thing that mattered was who was the hunter and who was the prey. Joanne knew with a sharp, cold certainty that she was no longer the latter. The noose was still there, but she was the one holding the knife.
The fire in the hearth crackled, casting long, dancing shadows across the cabin walls, but the warmth did not reach the cold knot of dread tightening in Joanne's stomach. She sat at the small wooden table, her fingers tracing the jagged edges of a heavy iron pendant she had found tucked away in a rotted leather satchel Rennick had brought from the deeper woods. For weeks, she had viewed him as a mysterious force of nature, a man who had simply stepped out of the mythic fog of the Blackwood. But as she cleaned the grime from the metal with a scrap of damp cloth, a symbol emerged that made the blood turn to ice in her veins. It was a crest she recognized from the forbidden tapestries in the capital, the snarling wolf of the Richmond dynasty, the royal line that Stephen Williams had claimed to have wiped out to the last babe in a night of fire and steel. Rennick sat across from her, his massive frame hunched as he worked on a bowstring, his movements methodical and patient. He looked up, his golden eyes catching the firelight, reflecting an intelligence that seemed to expand every time he spoke. He saw the pendant in her hand, and for the first time a shadow of profound, ancient grief passed over his rugged features. The silence between them was no longer the comfortable quiet of two survivors sharing a meal. It was a heavy, historical shroud that threatened to smother the small sanctuary they had built. "You aren't just a shifter, Rennick," Joanne whispered, her voice trembling as she held up the iron seal, the metal cold against her palm. "This belongs to the House of Richmond. Stephen told the world your people were monsters that needed to be put down for the safety of the realm. He built his throne on the ashes of your family. He told us there were no survivors, that the bloodline was severed forever." Rennick dropped the bowstring, his hands curling into fists upon the table. He leaned forward, the wood of the stool groaning under his immense weight. "Monsters," he repeated, the word tasting bitter and metallic. "He called us beasts so he could take the gold and the stone. My father, the king, he died protecting the iron gates while the city burned. My mother took the small ones into the trees, where the stone could not reach us. She became the wolf to save the prince. She taught us that the forest is the only kingdom that cannot be stolen." He touched his own chest, his voice dropping to a gravelly rumble that shook the tea tins on the shelf. "I am the Prince of the Ash. I am the son of the queen he murdered." The revelation hit Joanne like a physical blow, stealing the air from her lungs. The beast who had claimed her was the rightful heir to the very throne she had been sold to. Stephen Williams wasn't just a tyrant, he was a thief and a murderer who had spent a decade hunting the ghosts of his own crimes. The wolves that surrounded this cottage weren't just a pack, they were the remnants of a kingdom, a loyal guard that had waited 10 years in the shadows for their prince to grow strong enough to take back what was stolen. This was why the Blackwood felt so alive, so watchful. It was a nation in hiding. "You know he's alive," Joanne realized aloud, her mind racing through the political implications. "That's why the marshal is here. It isn't just about me. I was the excuse he needed to send an army into the Blackwood without raising suspicion from the other noble houses. He's not here to bring back a bride. He's here to finish the genocide he started. He's terrified of you, Rennick. He's terrified that the true king has come of age." Rennick stood, his presence suddenly so vast it seemed to push the walls of the cottage outward. He walked to the window, looking out into the darkness, where the 100 wolves kept their vigil. "He hunts a girl, he finds a war," Rennick said. There was a cold, regal authority in his tone that hadn't been there before. He was no longer just a survivalist, he was a monarch preparing for a reckoning. The rugged man who had learned to say rose was now the commander of a feral army. Joanne stood and joined him at the window, her reflection ghost-like against the glass. She looked at herself, pale, dark-haired, with eyes that no longer looked like those of a porcelain doll meant for a parlor. She saw the way she stood next to him, her shoulder nearly touching his, a partner in the shadow. She realized that her own escape had been the final piece of a much larger puzzle. If he finds out who you are, he will bring everything. He will burn the Blackwood to the ground just to see your bones. He won't stop at Oakhaven. "Let him burn," Rennick replied, turning to look at her. "The forest is old. The fire only makes the earth stronger. But you, Joanne, you stay? You go to him and be queen of the stone?" The question was the pivot on which her entire life turned. She could run, she could try to find another border, another identity, another lonely ruin to rot in, or she could stay and fight for a crown she had once despised, alongside a man the world called a monster. She thought of the silk downs that felt like shrouds, and the silver brushes that felt like shackles. Then she thought of the weight of the flint in her pocket and the warmth of the silver pup, Asher, who was now sleeping soundly by the fire. "I'm not going back to his cage, Rennick," she said, her voice ringing with a resilience she had forged in the frost. "I'm a Jame of the high peaks. My ancestors were explorers and warriors before they were courtiers. If Stephen Williams wants a queen, let him see what a queen of the Blackwood looks like. I would rather be a wolf in the dark than a bird in his gilded room." Rennick reached out, his hand cupping the side of her face. His skin was hot, his touch possessive but filled with a deep, burgeoning respect. He didn't see a victim or a pawn, he saw his equal, a woman who had walked into the mouth of the wild and refused to be eaten. "Then we prepare," he murmured, his thumb brushing over her cheekbone. The rest of the night was spent in a different kind of labor. The secret of the pendant changed the mission from simple evasion to tactical defense. They began to map the terrain with the precision of generals. Rennick explained the geography of the pack, how they held the high ridges and the narrow passes. Joanne shared her knowledge of the marshal's tactics, the way Stacy Thomas used scouts in pincer movements. They were two outcasts weaving a trap out of shadows and history, turning the cottage into a command post. As she worked, Joanne felt the last of her internal submissiveness wither and die. She had been raised to believe that her only power lay in her beauty and her bloodline, a currency to be traded by men. Stephen had wanted to use her to legitimize his stolen throne, to marry into her ancient family name to hide his own lack of lineage. But here, in the dim light of a crumbling cottage, she was finding a power that didn't require a decree or a priest's blessing. She was finding the power of the wild, the strength that comes from having nothing left to lose and everything to protect.
The iron pendant sat on the table between them, a silent witness to their pact. It was a heavy, cold thing, but to Joanne it felt like the first honest piece of jewelry she had ever touched. It represented a truth that the world had tried to bury under a decade of lies. "They'll call us cursed," Joanne said, looking at the fire. "The historians, the priests in the capital, they will say the Queen of the Blackwood was seduced by a demon. They will write songs about the girl who chose the beast." Rennick let out a low, dark laugh that sounded like the wind in the pines. "Let them speak. Words are for the weak who hide behind walls. We have the teeth. We have the night." As the dawn began to break, painting the snow in a bloody, sacrificial red, Joanne felt a strange sense of peace. The unveiling of Rennick's identity hadn't made her more afraid. It had given her a reason to stand her ground. She was no longer just running away. She was running towards a destiny she had chosen for herself. The martial shadow was still growing, and the king was surely on his way. But as she looked at the man who was a prince and the wolves who were his knights, she knew that the Blackwood would not be a graveyard for the House of Richmond. It would be their cradle. She reached for the iron pendant and slipped the chain over her head. The metal was cold against her skin, but it settled over her heart with a weight that felt like home. She looked at Rennick, who was already shifting his gaze back to the tree line, his nostrils flaring as he caught a new scent on the wind. The transformation in him was complete. He moved with the carriage of a king who had finally remembered his crown. "They come," he whispered, the gold in his eyes flaring. "Good," Joanne replied, her eyes reflecting the hidden fire of the hearth. The lonely cottage was no longer a refuge, it was an outpost of a forgotten empire. The 100 wolves began to stir in the undergrowth, a low hum of growls vibrating through the earth itself. The secret was out, the lines were drawn, and as the first horn of the king's vanguard echoed through the valley, Joanne Jame stood tall, her hand resting on the hilt of her hunting knife. She was the bride of the Blackwood, and she was ready for war. The sanctuary of the Blackwood was never truly silent, but the nature of its noise had begun to change. The wind no longer merely sighed through the pines. It whispered of movement in the valley, of the rhythmic thud of iron-shod hooves, and the metallic clatter of an empire in motion. Joanne Jame stood on the porch of the lonely cottage, her eyes narrowed as she watched a hawk circle the gray canopy. Beside her, Asher, the silver pup, sat with his ears pricked, his body tensing with a burgeoning instinct that mirrored her own. They were no longer just inhabitants of the forest, they were its guardians. Down in the village of Oakhaven, the atmosphere was thick with greed and desperation. Winter had been cruel to the small settlement, and the sight of King's gold was a temptation more powerful than any old superstition about the woods. Silas, a woodcutter whose hearth had been cold for weeks, had been tracking a deer near the northern ridge when he saw something that made his heart hammer against his ribs. He had seen the girl, the one the marshal's posters described with such clinical precision. But she was not cowering. She was standing in a clearing, her hand resting on the head of a massive midnight black wolf. The beast had looked at him with eyes of burning gold, and Silas had fled, the image of the monster and the witch seared into his mind. He didn't think of the herbal tinctures Joanne had traded to the village to cure the croup. He didn't think of the quiet grace she had shown when she first arrived. He thought only of the reward. Within the hour, Silas was kneeling before Stacy Thomas in the village square, his voice trembling as he spilled the secret of the cottage. The marshal listened with a terrifying, motionless intensity, her gloved hand resting on the hilt of her silver-etched sword. She didn't offer a smile, only a heavy purse of coin that clinked with the sound of betrayal. "The girl and the beast," Stacy murmured, her gaze turning toward the dark line of the Blackwood. "So the rumors of the Richmond ghosts were true. Prepare the torches, we move at sunset, and inform the men, use the silver tips. We aren't hunting a woman, we're hunting a legend."
At the cottage, the shift in the atmosphere was instantaneous. The 100 wolves, usually a presence felt rather than seen, began to draw inward. Rennick emerged from the trees as the first bruise-colored shadows of twilight stretched across the clearing. He didn't shift into his human form immediately. He stood as the great black wolf, his nostrils flaring as he caught the scent of pitch and scorched earth on the rising wind. When he finally shifted, his expression was carved from the very stone of the mountains. "They come," Rennick said, his voice a low, vibrating growl that made the windows of the cottage rattle. The man from the village, he brought the scent of the gold and the iron. Joanne felt a cold, sharp clarity wash over her. There was no room for the old fear, the trembling girl who had fled the capital. She reached for her heavy cloak, pinning it with the iron seal of the Richmond dynasty. "Silas," Joanne whispered, the name a bitter taste on her tongue. "I gave his daughter the bark for her fever. I suppose the king's gold pays better than gratitude." She looked at the cottage, the place that had been her cage, then her sanctuary, and now her fortress. She began to move with the efficiency Rennick had taught her. She checked the bars on the shutters and moved her supply of blinding powders to the heavy oak table. She didn't try to push Rennick away this time. She stood beside him, her hand finding his. His skin was blazing hot, the beast just beneath the surface roaring for the coming fight. "We cannot stay inside," Joanne said, her mind mapping the tactical terrain. "If they have torches, they will burn us out. We need to use the shadows of the hemlocks. The marshal will expect us to huddle like sheep. We must hunt like the pack." Rennick looked at her, a fierce, dark pride illuminating his amber eyes. He squeezed her hand, his strength enough to crush bone, yet tempered with a strange, feral tenderness. "You speak like a queen of the Richmond," he rumbled. "The trees are ours. The night is ours." The first sign of the encroaching world was a flicker of orange light at the base of the ridge. It was small at first, like a fallen star, but it multiplied quickly. 10, 20, 50 torches began to wind their way up the narrow path, a serpent of fire slithering through the ancient trees. The silence of the Blackwood was shattered by the harsh, discordant sound of men's voices and the clanking of plate armor. Joanne Jame rode at the front, her crimson cloak billowing behind her like a trail of blood. She held a crossbow, the bolt tipped with a shimmering, lethal silver that glowed in the torchlight. "Joanne Jame," Stacy Thomas' voice echoed through the trees, stripped of all its elegance, leaving only the cold command of the marshal. "By order of King Stephen Williams, you are commanded to surrender. Step out from that ruin and leave the beast to his fate, and you may yet see the capital again. Refuse, and we will leave nothing but ash." The men-at-arms fanned out, forming a semicircle of fire around the cottage. They looked nervous, their eyes darting to the darkness beyond the torchlight where they could feel the weight of 100 golden gazes. They clutched their spears and swords, the silver-tipped arrows notched and ready. They had been told they were hunting a monster, but the oppressive silence of the forest was making them feel like the prey. Joanne stepped forward, not out into the light, but into the space between the shadows of the porch. Her voice was steady, carrying a resonance that made the nearest soldiers flinch. "I am no longer a subject of Stephen Williams. I am a daughter of the Blackwood, and you are trespassing on ground that has forgotten the laws of men." Stacy Thomas narrowed her eyes, searching the gloom. She raised her crossbow, the silver tip pointing toward the sound of Joanne's voice. "Treason is a heavy burden for such a small throat, Joanne. Where is the shifter? Where is the creature that has bewitched you?" Rennick didn't wait for an invitation. He stepped out from behind Joanne, his human form silhouetted against the dying firelight from within the cabin. He stood at his full, imposing height, the iron pendant of his ancestors resting against his broad chest. The sight of him caused a ripple of terror through the ranks. The older soldiers recognized the look of him, the rugged, royal cast of his face that mirrored the kings of old. I am the Richmond, Rennick boomed, a primal sound that seemed to come from the earth itself, and you have brought fire to the home of the storm. For a heartbeat, the world held its breath. The civilized world and the wild stood on the precipice of a war a decade in the making. The torches flickered, casting grotesque shadows against the cottage walls. Joanne felt the flint in her pocket, her fingers closing around the cold stone. She looked at the men who had come to reclaim her as property, and she felt nothing but a sharp, resilient edge. "Kill the beast," Stacy Thomas commanded, her voice a sharp crack in the cold air. As the first silver-tipped arrow whisked through the darkness, Joanne didn't scream. She moved. She threw the first of her blinding powders into the nearest torch, the flash of magnesium white erupting like a supernova. The 100 wolves let out a collective howl that tore through the night, and the Blackwood finally stopped being a forest. It became a graveyard for the men who thought they could own the shadows. The treachery of Silas had brought the enemy to her door, but it had also ended the time for hiding. The battle for the Blackwood had begun.
The air exploded in a chaotic symphony of violence as the first volley of silver-tipped arrows hissed through the night. The light from the torches danced frantically, casting long, jagged shadows against the ancient hemlocks. Stacy Thomas stood at the center of the fray. Her face a mask was cold, professional detachedness as she commanded her men to advance. "Burn the structure!" she shouted over the rising din. "Leave the girl alive, but put the beast down." Joanne didn't wait for the fire to reach the porch. She moved with the fluid, calculated grace Rennick had spent weeks beating into her bones. She hurled a second pouch of magnesium powder into the nearest brazier, creating a blinding white flash that sent the soldiers reeling, their hands clutched to their eyes. In that heartbeat of distraction, the 100 wolves struck. They didn't bark or snarl. They were a silent, gray tide of muscle and teeth that swept from the undergrowth, dragging men from their saddles before they could level their spears. Rennick was a whirlwind of primal fury. He moved between his forms with a speed that defied the human eye, a bronzed warrior one moment and a midnight shadow the next. He stood as the ultimate shield between Joanne and the encroaching steel. But the marshal was no amateur hunter. She had anticipated the shifter's speed. As Rennick lunged to intercept a soldier aiming a torch at the cottage roof, Stacy Thomas leveled her heavy crossbow. She didn't aim for his heart, she aimed for the broad expanse of his shoulder, where the movement would be most restricted. The snap of the bowstring was lost in the howling wind, but the sound of the impact was sickeningly clear, a wet, heavy thud. Rennick let out a guttural roar, stumbling back as the silver bolt buried itself deep into his flesh. He didn't fall, but his movement faltered. Joanne saw the blood immediately, not the vibrant crimson of a standard wound, but a dark, bubbling violet that spoke of the belladonna and silver nitrate Stacy had used to coat the tip. "Rennick!" Joanne screamed, sliding through the mud to reach him as he collapsed against the porch steps. The marshal signaled for a second volley, but the pack had closed the distance. The clearing became a meat grinder of silver and fur. Joanne seized Rennick's heavy arm, her muscles screaming as she dragged him toward the relative safety of the cottage. The silver pup, Asher, snapped at the heels of a soldier who tried to follow, giving Joanne the precious seconds she needed to haul the Alpha inside and bar the heavy oak door. Outside, the world was ending in screams and fire, but inside the cottage, the silence was suffocating. Rennick lay on the floorboards, his breath coming in ragged, shallow rasps. His skin was turning a translucent, sickly gray, and the veins around the wound were darkening, spreading like a spiderweb of rot across his chest. He tried to speak, his amber eyes clouded with agony, but only a wet wheeze escaped his throat. Joanne's hands were shaking, but her mind was a cold, sharp blade. She had spent years in the capital studying under the court's finest apothecaries, learning the chemistry of poisons that the nobility used to settle their silent wars. She knew the properties of silver, how it reacted with the blood of the Richmond line to create a caustic, paralyzing rot. She didn't have a surgeon's tools, but she had the flint Rennick had given her, a bottle of high-proof grain alcohol, and the jars of ground charcoal and yarrow she had prepared. "Look at me, Rennick," she commanded, her voice sounding like the high-born lady she had once been, stripped of all doubt. "You taught me how to survive the woods. Now you have to trust me to survive the palace's filth. Stay with me." She poured the alcohol over the flint and the wound, the sizzle of the spirit against the silver-burned flesh making Rennick's body convulse. She had to be fast. The poison was moving toward his heart. She gripped the hilt of the stone knife and began the delicate, gruesome work of carving the silver shards from his muscle. Every cut was an agony she felt in her own soul, but she didn't flinch. She was no longer the girl who fainted at the sight of a bruised hand. She was the woman who had waded into freezing rivers and hunted in the dark. Blood soaked her wool skirt, staining the floorboards a deep, dark red. She worked by the flickering light of a single candle, her fingers slick as she retrieved the jagged metal bolt. It had splintered on impact, designed to leave as much poison in the bloodstream as possible. As she pulled the final fragment out, a geyser of dark blood followed. "The charcoal, Asher! Get back!" she hissed as the pup whined, pacing the room in a fever of anxiety. She packed the wound with a mixture of activated charcoal and crushed yarrow, a poultice designed to draw the toxins out before they could settle in his organs. She used her own silk shift, the last remnant of her old life, to bind the wound tight, her knots as secure as a sailor's. For a long minute, Rennick didn't move. The only sound was the thudding of the battering ram against the cottage door and the frantic barking of the wolves outside. Joanne stood up, picking up the heavy iron poker from the hearth. She looked at Rennick, who was already pushing himself up, his wound bound in the silk of the capital, his eyes fixed on the door with a lethally intent. She had proven her loyalty to the pack not with words, but with the grit of her nails and the clarity of her mind. She was no longer a guest in the Blackwood, she was its heart. The blood on the snow outside belonged to her enemies, and the blood on her hands belonged to her king. As the door finally burst open, revealing the smoke-stained face of Stacy Thomas and the glint of more silver, Joanne didn't retreat. She stepped forward into the light of the burning clearing, standing shoulder to shoulder with the man she had pulled back from the brink of death. The marshal had come for a girl, but she had found a queen, and the Blackwood was about to show the king's army that some wounds could never be healed with gold.
The smoke from the burning edge of the Blackwood did not drift toward the sky. It hung low and bitter over the clearing, a shroud for the men who had fallen in the marshal's failed assault. Through the haze, the sound of a different terror emerged, not the wild, chaotic howl of the pack, but the rhythmic, soul-crushing beat of imperial drums. From the darkness of the southern trail, a gilded carriage flanked by 200 heavy cavalrymen emerged. The horses were armored in steel plates, their riders carrying lances that gleamed with a cold, artificial light. At the center of this iron procession rode Stephen Williams, the civilized tyrant, draped in ermine and velvet that looked obscenely clean against the backdrop of the blood-stained snow. He dismounted with the unhurried grace of a man who believed the world was merely a stage built for his amusement. His eyes, a pale and piercing blue, scanned the wreckage of the cottage's perimeter. He did not look at the wounded soldiers or the scorched earth. His gaze was fixed solely on the threshold of the crumbling cabin. When he saw Joanne standing there, his lips curled into a thin, possessive smile. But as the wind cleared the smoke, the smile faltered. Joanne did not look like the woman he had sent the marshal to retrieve. Her silk shift was gone, replaced by boiled leather and wool stained with the dark violet of poisoned blood.
Her face was smudged with soot, her eyes reflecting a cold, predatory intelligence that he had never permitted her to possess. And she was not alone. To her right stood Rennick, the Alpha of Richmond, his chest bare despite the freezing wind, the white silk bandage across his shoulder a stark contrast to his bronzed skin. To her left, the silver pup Asher stood with his hackles raised, a miniature mirror of the 100 wolves that now emerged from the tree line to flank their queen. "Joanne," Stephen said, his voice carrying the smooth, cultured resonance of a man who dealt in decrees and executions. "I see you have developed a taste for the theatrical. You have led my marshal on a tedious chase, and you have surrounded yourself with livestock. It is time to put an end to this delusion. Step forward, and I may yet forgive the lives you have cost me this night." Joanne took a step, but she did not move toward him. She stepped into the center of the clearing, her hand resting on the hilt of the stone knife at her belt. "The only delusion here, Stephen, is the one you wear with your crown," she said, her voice steady and resonant, carrying across the clearing like a bell. "You didn't come for a bride. You came to kill the king of the Richmond because you are terrified that the world will find out you are a usurper. Look at the man beside me. Look at the eyes of the forest. Do you truly think your gold can buy the loyalty of the shadows?" Stephen's face darkened, the mask of the refined monarch slipping to reveal the jagged cruelty beneath. He gestured to his cavalry, the iron-shod horses stamping the snow. "I am the law. I am the civilization that keeps the dark at bay. You are nothing but a girl who has been broken by the cold, huddled in the dirt with a mongrel prince of a dead house." He turned his gaze to Rennick, his lip curling in disgust. I should have finished your kind 10 years ago. You are a ghost shifter, and ghosts are easily laid to rest with enough silver." Rennick stepped forward, his movement a slow tectonic shift of power. He didn't use the flowery insults of the court. He spoke with the weight of the earth. "The stone is hard, tyrant, but the root grows through it. You took my father's throne with fire. I will take your life with the night." The air between them seemed to ignite. With a roar that shook the remaining glass in the cottage windows, Stephen drew a sword of pure, tempered silver, a blade designed specifically to sever the life of a shifter. He lunged with a speed that spoke of a lifetime of elite training, the steel whistling through the air. Rennick did not retreat. He shifted mid-stride, his body a blur of midnight fur and corded muscle. The black wolf met the silver blade with a ferocity that sent sparks flying into the dark. The clearing became a blur of steel and fur, a dance of two worlds colliding. Stephen fought with the cold, mathematical precision of the civilized world, his thrusts and parries aimed at the vital points he had studied in manuals. Rennick fought with the ancient, unwritten laws of the wild, his attacks coming from angles a human mind couldn't predict. They were the two halves of a fractured kingdom, the usurper king and the wild prince, tearing at each other in the ruins of a sanctuary. Joanne stood her ground at the head of the pack. When a group of cavalrymen moved to intervene in the duel, she didn't wait for the wolves to act. She raised the iron pendant of the Richmond line, the moonlight catching the ancient seal. "The House of Richmond has returned," she shouted. "The forest remembers. Will you die for a thief, or will you live for the truth?" Her voice, combined with the terrifying sight of the 100 wolves closing the circle, made the soldiers hesitate. They saw the blood on her hands, the fire in her eyes, and the massive black wolf that refused to die despite the silver cuts appearing on his flanks. They were men of Oakhaven and the Southern Vales. They grew up on stories of the Richmond kings, and the reality standing before them was more powerful than Stephen's coin. In the center of the clearing, the duel reached its climax. Stephen had managed to drive his silver blade deep into Rennick's thigh, but the Alpha did not slow down. He used the wound to anchor himself, his massive jaws closing around the hilt of Stephen's sword and wrenching it from his hand. Stephen stumbled back, his eyes wide with a sudden panicked realization. His civilization, his walls, and his guards were useless here. He was alone in the dark with a predator he had spent a decade underestimating.
Rennick shifted back into his human form, his chest heaving, his skin mapped with silver-edged cuts that smoked in the cold air. He didn't kill Stephen immediately. He stood over him, a rugged, survival-driven king looking down at a man who had never known the meaning of the word. "The girl is not yours," Rennick rumbled, his voice a low, final decree. "The Blackwood is not yours. You are a guest in a house that hates you." Joanne walked toward them, her boots crunching on the frozen blood. She looked down at Stephen Williams, the man she had once feared more than death itself. He looked small now, huddled in his ermine in the mud. He reached out a hand, a reflex of his old entitlement. "Joanne, think of the realm. You belong in the light. You are a lady." "I was a lady," Joanne interrupted, her voice cold as the ice in the creek. "But I saved a wolf, and in return he saved the woman I was meant to be. I don't belong to the realm, Stephen. I belong to the pack." She looked at Rennick, and the communication between them was silent and absolute. They were no longer the fugitive and the monster. They were the architects of a new world. Rennick reached out his hand, and Joanne took it, her fingers interlocking with his. As the 100 wolves let out a collective howl of victory, the king's cavalry began to lower their lances. They saw the transformation. They saw the queen of the Blackwood and the prince of the ash standing together. The civilized tyrant was broken, his claim shattered at the threshold of a lonely cottage. The showdown was over, but the war for the capital was just beginning. Joanne looked toward the horizon, where the first light of a new kind of dawn was beginning to break. She was no longer hiding, she was leading.
The aftermath of the battle hung over the clearing like a heavy, suffocating blanket of ash and silence. The great war horses of the Imperial Guard stood with their heads bowed, their riders frozen in a state of shell-shocked uncertainty. Stephen Williams remained on the ground, a fallen idol stripped of his sword and his dignity, his fine velvet robes now indistinguishable from the mud and the slush. The 100 wolves sat in a wide, shimmering circle, their golden eyes reflecting the embers of the cottage's porch, which continued to hiss and pop as the fire finally began to die under the weight of a sudden, heavy snowfall. Stacy Thomas, the marshal, stepped forward from the line of soldiers. She had discarded her crossbow, her hands raised in a gesture that was less a surrender and more an acknowledgement of a new reality. She looked at Joanne, then at Rennick, and finally at the iron seal of the Richmond dynasty resting against Joanne's chest. The civilized world was waiting for a resolution, for a word that would dictate the future of the realm. "The tyrant is broken," Stacy said, her voice carrying across the silent clearing. She looked at Stephen with a cold, clinical disdain before turning back to Joanne. "The Council of Peers will not support a man who hid a genocide to secure his crown. But the kingdom needs stability, Joanne. You are a Jame. You are the chosen bride of the throne. If you return with us now, you can be crowned queen in your own right. You can rebuild the capital, bring the nobility to heel, and rule with the grace you were born to possess. You won't be a fugitive hiding in a ruin. You will be the law." The soldiers watched Joanne with a desperate hope. To them, she was the bridge back to the world they understood, a world of stone walls, warm beds, and the predictable hierarchy of the court. They offered her a return to the light, to the civilized safety of her former life, polished and perfected. Joanne looked at the marshal, then at the long line of armored men. She thought of the life they were offering, a crown that would still be a cage, a throne room filled with the same whispers and betrayals she had fled, and a life spent performing for an audience of vipers. She felt the weight of the iron pendant against her skin, the metal now warmed by her own body heat. Then she looked at Rennick. He didn't move to influence her. He stood with the blood of his enemies drying on his skin, his amber eyes deep and unreadable. He had given her the tools to survive, the language of the forest, and the strength to stand against a king. He was offering her the wild, a life of uncertainty, of hunting in the shadows, and of a freedom so raw it bordered on terrifying. He was offering her himself, not as a master, but as a mate.
"Choose, Joanne," Stephen rasped from the mud, his voice a pathetic shadow of its former authority. "You are a lady of the court. You belong to the palace. You cannot survive out here among the beasts. You were made to be claimed." At that word, claimed, the last fragment of the old Joanne Jame finally vanished. A small, cold smile touched her lips. She reached up and unfastened the heavy, mud-stained cloak she had worn through the winter, letting it fall into the snow. "You still don't see it, do you, Stephen?" she said, her voice ringing with a fierce, quiet power. "You think the only options are to be a queen in a cage or a fugitive in a hole. You think a woman is a piece of territory to be traded between men." She stepped away from the marshal, moving toward the center of the clearing to stand beside the black wolf who had become her king. "I am not going back to your stone rooms," Joanne continued, her gaze sweeping over the Imperial Guard, "and I am not a fugitive running from your law. I am the daughter of the Blackwood. I choose the pack. I choose the night, and most of all, I choose myself." She turned to Rennick, and the look they shared was one that transcended the need for human speech. It was the language of presence and protection, ancient and new. She reached out and took his hand, her fingers interlocking with his, the skin-to-skin contact sending a surge of primal recognition through her soul. She wasn't being claimed, she was joining. "The cottage is burning," she whispered to him, glancing back at the ruin that had seen her transformation. "The cottage was a shell," Rennick rumbled, his voice a low, resonant promise. "The forest is the home." Joanne looked back at Stacy Thomas one final time. "Go back to the capital. Tell them the Richmond line did not die in the fire. Tell them the Queen of the Blackwood is coming, but not as a bride. We are coming to reclaim what was stolen, not for a throne, but for the truth." With a sharp command-like whistle, Joanne called Asher to her side. The silver pup trotted to her, his tail wagging as he looked up at the woman who had saved his life. The 100 wolves rose as one, a gray tide of muscle and shadow that seemed to swallow the clearing. Joanne and Rennick turned their backs on the civilized world, on the fallen tyrant, and on the burning remains of the lonely cottage. They walked toward the deep, ancient heart of the Blackwood, their footsteps synchronized, their path lit by the pale moon and the golden eyes of their kin. Behind them, the fire finally consumed the last of the cottage's roof, the timbers collapsing in a shower of sparks that drifted up toward the stars like 1,000 tiny souls. The life behind Joanne had been a story written by others in ink and silk. The life ahead would be written in the language of the wild, in the tracking of the deer and the howling of the wind. It was a life of shadows and iron, of cold rivers and hot blood, and she had never felt more alive. As they disappeared into the tree line, the 100 wolves following in a silent, reverent procession, the forest seemed to close around them like a protective hand. The fugitive was gone, the bride was gone. There was only the pack, the night, and the long, certain road towards a kingdom that would finally remember its true name. The story of the lonely cottage had ended, but the legend of the Wolf Queen and the Prince of Ash was just beginning. They moved together into the darkness, two predators finally home, leaving the world of men to wonder at the shadows they had left behind. Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed this story. Feel free to share your thoughts in the comments. I truly love reading them. If you'd like access to more exclusive stories, you can find them on my Patreon page. The link is in the description. Until next time, see you in the next story.